Daern, Chapter 1, The Edge of the World, Part 1. Gale. Gale's feet fled in and out of his view as he ran in the shallows of the river, like pale darting fish in the icy water. He risked a glance over his shoulder, his eyes flicking left to right, searching the shadowed woodland. Were they gone? Dark pines marched behind him in orderly rows. Their dull needles rustled and whispered to the murmuring stream, as though to comment on his obtrusive passing. He slipped on a smooth rock in the stream and fell forward with a splash. His threadbare clothes were soaked through, but the cold felt good on his trembling legs and aching muscles. The young man sat and watched the water curling and swelling around him. From behind and not so far away, a high horn call could be heard, ebbing and flowing. Gale's heart stopped. Another call answered the first, a long drawn-out wail. With no further encouragement, he sprang forward like a spurred horse, stumbling through the water, slipping and sliding across the algae-coated rocks. A third horn call joined in, this one much closer. The slave hunters had found his trail. He scrambled onto the bank, pushing through the dense undergrowth. Reeds gave way to ferns, then he was amongst the trees, their low-hanging branches whipping across his face. Despite the pain, however, he felt heartened. It was getting brighter, and the air fresher. Not much further. It can't be much further. He repeated the words in his mind, over and over again, like a prayer, hoping that this time they would be true. Yes, he could see it now. The forest was thinning, the dark watchful trees being replaced by younger, greener ones. The brooding shadows fell away, and he broke into an open space at last. Gale hissed and shielded his eyes, dazed by the sudden sunlight. He squinted around him, like a wary animal, and looked up into a clear, cloudless sky, the view unimpeded by bough or needle. He turned around to stare back into the twilight depths of the forest, as though to convince himself of where he stood. I'm outside, but where are the Mulroino? Overhead, Nostiarna, the great moon, was already nearing Edgerman, the sun. Soon, he would eclipse her and bring on the night. Gale spotted a small rise and dashed up it. He gazed out over the foreign landscape, intimidated for a moment by how open and empty it was. He'd lived most of his life with trees always crowding around him. What had once felt claustrophobic, however, now seemed comforting. Out there among the rocky hills and crumbling boulders, he'd be exposed. No time to think about that. Near the horizon, he spotted chimney smoke rising into the air. Nestled between two enormous granite outcrops, like a bird nest wedged between tree branches, was a small cluster of buildings. His fellow slaves had told him about this place. Its features were unmistakable. Stone's Cradle. A village that marked the edge of a vast country. Beyond it, the land dropped off. Encircling the town, he saw a familiar sight. Sprawling farm fields. The crops swayed gently en masse, like a shimmering carpet. Gale licked his lips, already salivating. Food. Behind him, the horns sounded again, followed by the terrible baying of a hound. They're getting closer. His heart caught in his throat as he stared down the near vertical incline before him. It was littered with rocks and the gnarled roots of a few clinging shrubs. Plenty of places to break an ankle. He closed his eyes. But not many places to leave a footprint. Without pausing to give himself time to change his mind, he plunged down. Half falling, half leaping, he scrambled from rock to rock, and landed at the bottom, in a bruised, battered heap. He coughed and wheezed as the pommel of the stolen sword swinging at his side rammed into his gut. He ripped the bare sword off his belt, ready to throw the stupid thing into the tall grass. He froze, though, gripping the stained leather hilt. No, they'll find it. Leaving the sword would be as good as drawing an arrow in the dirt. He stared at his blurred reflection in the gleaming metal. Auburn hair escaped from beneath his hat in dirty clumps, framing a thin, pale face. His dark green eyes were large and round in his bruised sockets. With numb surprise, Gale realized that he hadn't slept properly for nearly 3 days. What happened to you? He reluctantly tore his eyes away from the sword and shoved it back through his belt. When did I even get the sword, anyway? Limping, he forced himself into an unsteady jog, The last straggling trees gave way to scrubby grasslands speckled with rocks and juniper bushes. He recalled clearly right up until last night. I was sold. His lip curled with bitter resentment at the thought. To someone in Daern. As he thought of that place, unhappy memories tried to swim up from the depths of his mind, but he forced them back to whatever hole they had crawled out of and focused. They was transferring you, and then what? What did I do? Escaped. But how? He ground the heel of his hand into one tired eye. His vision was becoming as blurry as his recollections. He looked down and noticed the rags tied around his feet. That was something. They had loosened as he ran and now trailed behind him like streamers. It was a miracle he hadn't tripped over them. I tore up my shirt and wrapped my feet. He remembered feeling clever when he'd snuck past the sleeping Mulronyo. His muffled footsteps on the forest floor had been nearly imperceptible. Still distracted by the rags, which he noticed were stained with dirt and blood, Gale careened into a bush. As he floundered to free himself, a branch snagged his sleeve and jerked him back. No, not again! Panic seized him, blood roaring in his ears and limbs shaking. The Mulronyo camp rose up behind his eyelids, suddenly as real as it had been last night. 3 lumpy shapes lay on the ground, and the air was filled with the sound of their steady breathing. 3. Why are there only 3? Where's the 4th? In the moonlight, a hand leapt out of the darkness, gripping his wrist like a manacle and jerking him back. Let me go! Let me go! Gale screamed and ripped his sleeve away from the bush. The branch snapped off and fell to the ground. He stared at the twig's thorny fingers and saw it again in his mind. The hand that had grabbed him, lying in a pool of blackening blood amongst the forest's thick bed of dead needles. He gagged on the memory and doubled over, dry heaving until his throat was raw. But there had been next to nothing in his stomach for days, and all that came up was burning bile. He scrubbed his mouth with a shaking hand, as the last of the memory faded. He spoke aloud to himself, cold sweat trickling down his brow. Must have taken the sword after his hand was lost. Gale coughed, his voice a harsh croak. He rubbed his throat and fell back to gnawing on his thoughts. That didn't make any sense, though. If you took the sword after, how did his hand... He dug his nails into his knees, holding on to the present, as his memories threatened to overwhelm him again. Didn't think about it anymore. Later. Gotta keep moving. Slowly, the miles faded behind him, along with the day's light, as the great moon veiled the sun overhead. The horns still called shrilly, but for the time they remained distant. While painful, his shortcut down the cliff seemed to have thwarted the hunters. The boulder-strewn wildlands gave way to neatly tended fields, where rows of barley hung their heavy heads. He was now treading the beginnings of a hard-packed road. Across the fields, cottages of stone and thatch appeared. From their windows, warm light spilled out into the dusk, and the faint sound of cheerful laughter reached him. Of their own accord, his feet started carrying him towards the distant sound, but he hesitated. No, gotta hide. Leaving the road, he cut into a field, the stalks of grain enclosing him. He collapsed and laid in the dirt, listening to the sound of his ragged breathing. He could go no further. He would just have to trust the hard ground and the thick barley to hide his passing. Overhead, the stalks waved gently in the wind, and his eyelids grew heavy as he watched their undulating shadows, which followed him down into fitful dreams. Thanks for listening to Daern, a story in progress. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like, and if you really enjoyed it, consider donating through Patreon. Any amount will go a long way towards helping us bring more content to you. Links to our Patreon and our website are in the description. See you next week, and have a good one.